You can shut the door if you want, yeah. Hello, I'm just gonna... Hello, good evening and welcome. Let's turn the music off. Right. Hello, good evening and welcome to this week's philosophy research discussion. With me this evening is Morrigan, and she's going to be chatting with me. We're going to be talking a little bit about good faith. For those of you who are interested, this is the session I do on a Monday night in between teaching at the Free University of Brighton, where I teach philosophy. And next week, October the 5th, Monday, October the 5th, a new course of Plato and Deleuze begins. So you're more than welcome to join us there, particularly if you're a Free University of Brighton person, in which case you just need to go to River, go to the forum for it. And if you're not in the Free University of Brighton, then go to my Twitch page, and there's a Discord and some of the materials we put up there, and if people want to ask questions there, they can. What we're going to do tonight, as I say, I'm going to chat to Morrigan about good faith, kind of good faith in terms of politics and philosophy. We'll kind of get to why that is. But I wanted to start the kind of conversation to sort of set the frame for it. It's something I watched earlier this week which sort of got me thinking, and because I'm thinking a lot about good faith and things like that anyway, the kind of things connected up a bit. But it also was interesting because it was a piece by David Graeber, who recently died. And so it's kind of interesting to look back at some of what he's saying and engage with his work. And this is him talking about his book on bullshit jobs at the RSA. And he's kind of talked a little bit about the background to the book and how it came about, and the sort of the stories and the anthropological interactions that led him to write the book. And then he kind of makes this point towards the end that I think, you know, is interesting, and I want to talk about a little bit. So first of all, then, we're just going to have a little look at some David Graeber. So it's about 5 minutes we'll watch.
Okay, I'll just. I mean, there's a lot of things I could say. I could go through the typology, but I think the political implications of all this are something that I would like to emphasize. One reason that I wrote this book, you know, I'm an anti-capitalist anarchist personally. I've been involved in direct action movements for a long time, and it always seems to me that capitalism is being held together more by moral arguments than anything else at this point, because most of the old practical arguments don't really apply. You know, for the last 50 years, you just said, well, you know, capitalism creates great inequality, but at least, you know, it lifts all boats, and even poor people know their children will be doing better off in the next generation, and nobody believes that anymore. That's obviously not true. The other argument was it creates a big, strong middle class, and that leads to political stability, and that's clearly not the case. The other one was technological. You know, well, we're all going to be on Jupiter in a few years. There's going to be endless inventions. Capitalism is a huge engine for creativity, and, you know, instead we just get like iPhone 7, iPhone 8. You know, all the sci-fi stuff just, it used to happen, but capitalism seemed to stop producing that stuff all of a sudden. So none of those things are true. So in a large way, I think the only two arguments left are, well, anything else would be worse. You know, it's us or North Korea, basically. And the other argument is, well, it's basically moral. It's just like, people really do believe that if you don't pay your debts, you're a bad person. I mean, unless you're rich, in which case it doesn't matter somehow. But you know, if you're Donald Trump and you go bankrupt, they elect you president. But you know, if you're an ordinary person, you're a deadbeat and a bad person. And so that one really works. People feel that, you know, you really have to pay your debts. It doesn't matter if you've been maneuvered into it, which is a really, really convenient thing for the guys who are running a financialized system, right? Michael Hudson actually made the argument that, you know, 30 years ago, rich people discovered that poor people actually feel they should pay their debts, which had never occurred to them because they don't, right? It's true. I mean, people ask me why I'm a professor. They say, why don't you become a writer? It'll be more fun. You'd set your own hours. You wouldn't have to do all this admin work. And I always say, well, there's one thing about academia which isn't true of being a musician, being an artist, being a writer, any of those things, which is they never ever pretend they just forgot to pay you. Every month, there it is, like clockwork, and anything, where they have any excuse not to pay their debt to you, they won't do it. It's just amazing. That's why we have agents, I could tell you stories. But, all right, so debt is one thing, and the other one is work. They really seem to have convinced people that if you aren't working harder than you want to be working at something you don't particularly enjoy, preferably under the orders of somebody you don't like, then you're just a bad person. You don't deserve help. You don't deserve relief. No one should love you. And how that happened is one of the things I've tried to investigate over the course of the book. How it is that we see work as this kind of a act of self-abnegation. It's a secular hair shirt. It's supposed to be suffering. To the point where, if you get anything out of work, it lowers the value rather than making it better. Even the knowledge that you are helping other people. So there's this perverse idea that not only is it generally true, and there are exceptions to every rule, but it is generally true that the more your work benefits others, the less you're likely to get paid for it. But people think that's okay. In fact, a lot of people think that's right. Well, we shouldn't pay teachers too much. You don't want people who are greedy teaching our children, that sort of thing. That comes out of this idea that work should be suffering itself. Anything you get out of it mitigates its self-sacrifice value, and that is the flip side of a serious system of consumerism. So, we deserve our furtive consumer pleasures because we spend most of the day suffering. And therefore, the uselessness of work actually adds to its value in some perverse way, unconscious way, rather than enhancing it. Something like that must be going on. Why is it that it's considered acceptable that nurses and the guy who gives you trade information or people who actually help you in some way should pay the cost of austerity and bankers shouldn't? How does that make any kind of moral sense to anyone? It's can only be through some sort of logic. Well, you guys are self-sacrificing, go self-sacrifice. And so what I was trying to do is to take aim at that kind of moral argument. I wrote one book about that. That seemed to work fairly well. So this is my contribution to the debate about work.
Okay, so let's just bring us back. So that was, I thought, Graeber doing something really, exemplary of what he would do well, which is create these kind of brilliant simplifications that make sense, and that kind of, were relatively straightforward to get hold of. And I think that's one of the things that was fantastic about Graeber's work in some ways. I don't want to call it, it's not popularization when something is kind of, is a good account of things, and people notice that. So I think it's one of the things it's very good at. And also there's a kind of nice, almost straightforward and graspable hypothesis about a current situation with capitalism to do with this relationship to debt and work. And the kind of failure of other arguments, and I think it was that began me thinking. So his argument depends upon this failure of other arguments. They no longer work, So this idea that capitalism might be able to provide some sort of benefit, in like empirical or quantifiable terms, one that we can clearly see and identify, the one that we're constantly told about, in terms of, technology may be terrible, but think about your life expectancy, we're kind of things that can be seen and are kind of tangible, and the idea that any argument to do with capitalism being able to provide those kind of tangible, quantifiable benefits in the future are kind of now plainly, obviously wrong, and only moral arguments are left. And I was kind of struck by that almost. I mean, his interest is in the work and the debt bit, but I was struck by this kind of this failure or any other kind of argument other than a moral one.
But isn't like But hasn't that always been the case? You know, work makes you free, or the Protestant work ethic, or there's a great book actually by a historian, I can't remember his name, but the book's called Remember Ahanagran, and it talks about the building of America by Irish migrants right from the turn of the 20th century. And what the main feature of this is no one gave you a helping hand. That was it. You arrived at the port, no one gave you anything unless they were related to you, unless they were part of a very kind of distinct community that already knew you. You made it on your own. That's the American dream, you know. And the morality around that it wasn't that this was good for you, or that none of that was there. It was just like, you can make it. This is raw capital.
So do you think that there's never really been quantifiable arguments as to why capitalism might be a good thing, or, you know, at least worst option? And has it always been the
No,
worst
I don't. I mean, I
possible
think for a while there was some bullshit around, like, but I think they called it benign capitalism or something like that. You know, the idea of a sort of paternalistic capitalism. That's how you get the welfare state. That's how you get kind of universal and general education. And obviously we're looking at this in a very kind of Western-centric way at the moment. But that hasn't been true everywhere. You're talking about a European experience almost, you know. You're not talking about like 12-year-old girls getting married in Utah or wherever the hell that happens. You know, you're not talking about no health system if you're poor. You're not referring to any of that. You know, there's this sort of like moral good and moral fibre of capitalism that follows this kind of democratic rather than republican route. I think might actually be quite peculiarly, I don't know, of only of certain blocks of capital, if you like.
Right, yes. Obviously the idea that capitalism is the same everywhere is kind of blatantly incorrect. And in some ways, I suppose that whole notion of a racial capitalism kind of tries to show this kind of relationship where capitalism plays out very, very differently, in fact, depending upon where you are and how you're engaging.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of it in terms of the States and just over the border, Canada, you know.
Still, I suppose, okay, so let me try and see if I can sort of go back to the same moment of like rupture or division that he's identifying. Kind of some arguments fail, and so we're only left with some other arguments. And I mean, I suppose I was kind of curious about this relationship to good faith, because, you know, it looks like as soon as we think of it as a moral argument as to whether capitalism is good or bad, or has benefits or not, you know, any moral argument kind of brings up this question of good or bad faith, the sincerity of the position. And obviously, you know, a lot of the time moral arguments, particularly with philosophers, are a kind of game of, like, you know, winning an argument rather than... So they're a kind of game that, rather than what we presumably assume is at the heart of a moral argument, which is a sincere attempt to think about, you know, the right thing to do. I mean, otherwise, presumably, it's all just bullshit. So let's just, assuming it's not everyone who talks about morality is just talking bullshit. If they're sincere, presumably they're talking about kind of what's the right thing to do, you know. And I mean, I was kind of struck by how like strongly I keep thinking of Sartre's bad faith in that situation, and of like how there's this real kind of difficulty in being able to be reflective and not be in bad faith. And so there's a kind of strange thought about, as soon as you need to think about whether capitalism is a good thing or a bad thing, like some kind of moral argument, you know, the very fact that you need to think about it is actually a problem. How can you do it sincerely? How can you carry out an economic practice, you know, that isn't kind of obviously right, if you have to think about why it's right and how it can be right, the minute you do that, there's always the possibility of cheating. There's always the possibility of something being exploited. There's always, and it was kind of, when I looked up good faith, one of the things that popped up was its strange relationship to the law, the way in which it has a kind of curious history of being codified. Some places very early, some places not at all, and so that seems to suggest that when we're talking about things like a moral argument, I mean, is it the moral argument that comes first, or is it debt that needs us to have a moral argument? Is kind of my thought here. The debt kind of needs you to do that. So it's not really a moral argument. It's a kind of excuse for maintenance of debt. So I was curious about why it was a moral argument, or why it seemed that way.
I don't know. I have a feeling that I've had a very different response to what Graeber says.
Oh, well, why don't you tell me about your response?
Well, my response was in terms of suffering, and how suffering. You can't possibly be working hard or doing anything hard enough unless you suffer. And obviously, with a sort of familiarity with Catholicism, this is generally the case, and so in terms of the debt, I don't know, I think I just heard a different thing, like a very different thing. So in terms of the debt, it's very hard when you have a kind of religious background, because certain things just seem almost sort of, endemic in me, that I'm not religious anymore, but certain things just seem sort of like a bit endemic. So this idea of, someone holds the debt, and you are accountable for that debt, and it's on your sheet. Even if you kind of like look at Jews, the idea that the father holds the debt for the son until the bar mitzvah, whereupon the has the account sheet, has the balance sheet, if you like, whereupon the son then has to take responsibility for their own actions. There's always this idea that somehow some debt has to be repaid because there's some, dead guy on a cross, or, and that the way to some sort of emancipation or some sort of freedom is always paved with suffering. So I'm not sure how that aligns with capitalism or good faith and bad faith, but that's sort of, that's just what it made me think of.
Okay, I think that's good. I mean, those, when he was talking about work, yes, I mean, that whole notion of self-sacrifice at the heart of work is a really strange one, because I mean, I was immediately prompted to think of the practices. Hang on, let's just check the chat there. Sorry, indebtedness and owning as owing to your community existing gift, yet in non-capital economies. Yeah, right. So there's a kind of many ways in which those debts can form, and self-sacrifice is also can have many different forms. And because I kind of thought of the relationship of like self-sacrifice and sorcery, for example. And often, even in there, you get this strange notion, particularly from a slightly more Crowleyite background, where they talk about, or Thelemic background, where they talk about, the great work or something. And that relationship to self-sacrifice and work seems like it can be coherently kind of, thought about. Not always, but it can be coherently thought about as a kind of positive, a kind of a growth or an education or an empowerment, all sorts of ways in which it can be kind of thought about positively. So there's a kind of relationship to work as discipline or direction, and as a kind of counter to dissipation that kind of like seems to be very distinct from the kind of self-sacrifice he's talking about in relationship.
Yeah, but he's not talking about work. He's talking about the wage.
Yeah. Do you think he needed to? I mean, do you think that's? I mean, he did talk about work, didn't he? In terms of bullshit jobs. So
bullshit jobs. Yeah, I mean,
right,
that's the thing. But it was interesting that he kind of like counterposed that to writers, musicians. It was interesting that he made that kind of, as if they were diametrically
Yeah,
You
I
know.
don't think he was counting being an academic as a bullshit job, actually. I think he was more...
Do you not?
No, I think he was more thinking of admins, and he was just talking about his nice relationship to a stable wage. Well, obviously, that's, I think, which is, to be understandable. I mean, I want to go back to this idea of, like, and this kind of, you get bits of this obviously from Nietzsche, and you get bits of this from different places around relationships to debt, and as Machinadas has mentioned, in terms of gift economy, debt as well. But the idea of the contract, I mean, this is something that came up last week where I was talking about a woman called Pistor, and her sort of idea that capitalism has to be understood in terms of, like, some of the very sort of detailed legal documents, like an EU treaty or whatever, and the way in which these are kind of actually instantiated, actually made into real things. And there, that kind of, the idea of the contract seems, I mean, a very if there's a sorcery at the heart of capitalism, presumably it's around this relationship to something like contract. And the way in which that relationship is set up and then manipulated, the way in which, as it were, it's kind of framed and organised, and its intention is structured, even if unintentionally. And so thinking it in terms of that way, and then going back to the thought about your self-sacrifice and work, and it's to do with being a wage. I mean,
yeah, okay. The idea of the contract. So when I think of contracts, I think of, people buying and selling houses, or, you pay for something and then someone confirms your order, and, and it has an agreed delivery date or something like this. Contract is often to do with money. It's to do with money, and it's to do with time. Yeah. And interestingly, if you look at the way that people are meant to think about their jobs, let's call it jobs, it's easier. The way people are meant to think about their jobs, they apply these SMART goals, don't they? So, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound, and these are the sort of contracts that are made in this sort of, I wouldn't say it's bullshit actually, but in these sort of ways. But interestingly, we don't have a contract in this country with our government, with our state, or anything like that. And whenever
you're talking about a written constitution as a contract here,
well, kind of, yeah. I mean, we basically have consent, don't we? So as we saw on Saturday, the kind of main thing that people were talking about is we do not consent. I do not consent, Whereas in somewhere like the States, and I don't know about other countries, I think France has this as well, but I don't know. People stand up and, they make a pledge. They have a pledge to the union. We don't have that, and that part of that is a moral pledge, and we don't have that, as is all implied, implicit, not explicit.
I'm still kind of like pondering about this. I think there's a kind of I suppose if we're asking if capitalism is a good thing or a bad thing, then I can kind of, and the idea is, sorry to go back to this starting point and to circle back, and the idea is that quantitative arguments rather, kind of particularly ones that give us the sense that capitalism will produce some kind of slightly better future. If Goebbels right and all those are kind of dead, don't work. It seems like I don't believe people have made moral choices about work as self-sacrifice or debt as something that they have to pay back. I don't really believe that's how people. I kind of don't believe that's how people actually think.
Neither a borrower or a lender be. People have these things.
You're talking about it being in folk wisdom, but if it's in folk wisdom, it's a lot older than just capitalism.
Yeah, also, I'm a bit sort of like, capitalism will make things better. 72 million people died in the Second World War. I don't know who these people are that have climbed on board with this idea that capitalism will somehow make things better.
I suppose he's trying to articulate a kind of liberal democratic free market capitalism without the errors, not neoliberal, but like a classical conservative.
Well, he's talking about the American dream.
Yeah, in that situation, I suppose that's partly what it is. I mean, yes, sometimes.
And anyone that
sometimes just even considering.
But anyone that thinks that the American dream was anything other than Dust Bowls in the 1930s or a complete lack of healthcare coming out of the 1940s. I mean, Truman actually wanted to set up a national health service, but they wouldn't have it. And then there's Vietnam. I mean, there's Jim Crow laws. There's Emmett Till. I mean, I don't know when this golden age of this American dream was ever meant to happen.
Okay, let me try it another way. No, I'm just trying out a thought in different ways. So I kind of don't think it's an anti-capitalist strategy. I don't think it's a good idea for that to be fully grounded or solely grounded on a kind of moral argument. Right, and I think it's kind of crucial, and I think the climate debate is an example of this. It's crucial in a sense that part of the argument against capitalism is not that it has some sort of moral failing, which it may also have, but the main problem is that it's a fucking stupid machine that tends to self-destruction, and this is a really stupid fucking machine, and we shouldn't really be driving this fast. And for God's sake, get off the fucking road and let's go get a fucking horse or something, because this is fucking bonkers. And in a kind of quantitative way almost, it's like it does not do very well. This is a really fucked up system, and because then it points you as to why would you carry on operating a stupid system, and it's like, well, we're not. The stupid system is being operated precisely by a particular class of people for whom it's not stupid, and it kind of works very, very well, but at everyone else's expense. And this seems like not a moral argument, to me. That's kind of the primary direction of. And so in that situation, I do think the relationship to work and to debt are kind of, they are central to capitalism, how capitalism works in a sense, but they're not central to the problem of capitalism. They're kind of separate problems. How we deal with contract or debt, or how we deal with, work or labour or whatever you want to call it, stuff that needs doing. And stuff that you want to improve on. Do you see what I mean? So I think they're kind of separate issues almost, and it seems, or maybe that's one line of thinking.
I don't know when this idea of debt arrived. Because if I think about the poor laws, coming in under Elizabeth I, Tudor England, if you like. What they used to do is, if someone was in poverty, they would brand them. It was a punishment. It was a punishment to be poor, and then it swung another way where it wasn't a punishment, and we were meant to be had to have some sort of moral fibre, and we were meant to sort of support this in some sort of way. And then you go all the way through blah, workhouses, la la la, and go all the way along. So the debt thing, how you saddle people with this idea that they are indebted to the machine and therefore they have to keep feeding the machine. Is that what you're talking about? Not really.
Yeah, no, in a sense. I think it is. I mean, debt demands good faith, in a sense, to be operable as a kind of coherent social relationship.
Right. So right now we have a really good example of where this isn't in good faith. So all the students that go to university, nothing to do with coronavirus, but they're all going, and it's costing them something like, I don't know, £18,000 a year or something like this if they get maintenance loans and tuition fee loans, etc., etc. So over a period of 3 years, that adds up to about 50 grand, and they can also take out a loan for a master's. That's £60,000. About 80% of these people have no intention of ever paying that back. They know it's going to get written off after 30 years. They don't care. It's not in their intention to do this. If they happen to earn enough so it sits there like an extra little tax, that's fine. But they are not seeing it as a debt these days, which I think which I think is not the intention. I think that the student loans were meant to replace the mortgages, because no one can afford, well, not no one, but only a few people can afford to get on the property ladder, and how else are we going to keep driving people out there unless they owe something?
But because it's not attached to your home, it now looks... He said at one point, people's relationship to debt, particularly this distinction between rich people and poor people's relationship to debt being quite distinct, but also, how the idea that people need to pay their debts even if they know they've been manoeuvred into it. And I think what you're pointing to is actually where that's maybe wrong. He's maybe not right here, and I think you're right. I think a lot of, I'm sure all the students will call it debt, because that's its name, it's student debt. But you're right. I think I would be surprised if most students are in good faith with relationship to that debt. I was thinking, why would you be in good faith with relationship to this debt? Because you kind of know you've been manoeuvred into it, and if there's some way in which you can skip out and not fucking pay, yeah, of course you're going to take it. If you can get away with it, you're going to get away with it as quickly as possible, as soon as possible. But that's kind of what I mean about the idea of debt. If you're going to have debt as an operable concept, you kind of need that kind of relationship to good faith to be the dominant mode of debt. You can have obviously the edges where people are scamming each other a bit, but if it's not fundamentally organised like that, then actually it's useless. It becomes fucking useless. And I was thinking about, I'll move on to a slightly different take. So I was thinking about two different kinds of working class experience at the moment. Unfortunately, Machinators' long message got stopped. Yes, by the auto mod. Sorry about that, Machinators. So by the auto, and so there were kind of two different kinds of working class experience in relationship to debt at the moment, at least in sort of Western capitalism, I suppose, or in the UK. I'm thinking mainly of, because that's my experience. And so you have working class experience that's organised around negotiating the flows of debt. So the cycling of credit cards into, new deals and all that sort of stuff, which lots of people are familiar with, right? Exactly. I mean, this is kind of a normal part of experience, or people's leases on their cars or their mobile phones or their Sky or their broadband or whatever. And this kind of continual flow in which debt is just another utility that you're kind of paying, and it's being organised in a kind of structure like that. And it's much more variable than most other utilities, although utilities have been quite variable. So it's the one you kind of have to have most difficulty with. And then the other working class experience of exclusion from debt because of credit scoring and the relationship that people have to, a completely different dynamic in relationship to the flows of capital, and how each of these flows help organise a future. So for the flows of debt, one of the things that they do in society is they kind of organise this future into a kind of, as though you have agency. It's longer in its length.
Actually, I think something more subtle is going on there. I think debt of the first kind that you describe, people shifting their credit cards about and organising loans, etc., etc. That actually is quite precarious. It only works as long as people can manage it, and once they can't manage it, they fall into the other category of not being able to raise debt. They can't raise credit to that extent. And so it's almost like what happens is that capitalism can't lift everybody into the middle classes and leave this underclass behind, because too many people have been lifted. So every once in a while it has to give them a really good slap and send 50% of them back down, because the amount of people I know that have tried to manage their debt and have ended up bankrupt, or having to flog their houses, or various other things like that, because actually that debt management, it looks like it's open to the kind of aspiring working class, but it's only actually manageable for about 30% of the people engaged in it.
Machinator Streamlabs has just told him to stop sending long messages while commenting on Twitch. He was going to mention the free citizen movement, birth registration, same as ship registration, the Tamdam abstract vessel. That sounds interesting. I'll have to try and maybe get to you at some point on that. Maybe that might be for a future conversation when we can talk about that some more. Maybe that sounds good. I mean, you're right, there's a kind of catastrophic relationship to debt, and it's never going to be, and it looks like it's organised in such a way that it can't be kind of universalised.
I think it's organised on purpose to do that. Is that debt is used as a leverage in that way.
I mean, that would kind of sort of gel with the kind of thought I was having where you have these two different experiences. So working class experience in relationship to money, wage, work is always kind of, or often orientated around this division point between relationships to debt being, you know, coherent or incoherent. I mean, you even find this sometimes when you talk about, like, you know, like the whole sort of what swathes of services there to kind of organise and reorganise relationships to death and debt. There you go. there's the Freudian drive coming through. So that, and I think that division in a relationship, or that dividing point, actually is a kind of really interesting thing, because I think it has a very strong relationship to how much future you get.
But I have no idea what you were trying to write, machinators. But that birth registration, the same as ship registration, it really makes me think about how, in any efforts to try and track how many people died in the as a consequence of just the Atlantic slave trade, not any other forms of slave trade, is that they track the ship's manifests because the people were seen as goods, not as people. Yeah. So you can only incur debt if you have property in yourself. Yeah, if you're not sovereign, you can't incur debt. You can't enter contracts. You can't do any of that. So they're kind of like the idea that this had some sort of like moral principle to it. I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking of a moral principle as a kind of like a good or something like this, and I'm
I think that's
that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the generous way of reading the idea of a moral principle here perhaps would be something like a value system. So, you know, you're a better person if you are self-sacrificial at work and you manage your debt well, and you're a worse person if, you know, you are a fucking, you know, you skip out on all your loans and you can't be asked to do anything, and you're a stoned fucking philosopher or something. that kind of thing. And so it's a kind of value judgment, which I don't suppose you have to accept to acknowledge exists. I suppose that would be something like the argument. So that's how I would read his kind of talk about it being a moral argument, not like a moral argument in the sense of, like, as I say, not a philosopher's moral argument, but a kind of moral image almost.
Yeah, but you also seem to be saying that you're only really a person if you have debt. And obviously there's a big bunch of people who are excluded from having debt.
God, I'm not saying that. I'm definitely not saying that. What I am saying, I suppose, is that image, that value system, kind of presents that idea, and gives that sense to people. I mean, I'm going. So Nietzsche also talked about debt, and one of the things I kind of want to, it's kind of going back to the same kind of thing a little bit, another sort of angle. There's something inevitable, it seems, about social structures need kind of ways of binding together, you know, ways of bringing a future, a past and a present together, in a kind of particular, let's say that's an x-axis, and you also need a kind of y-axis in which, you know, you bind people together, and this is how you kind of coordinate social structures in some sense along these kind of axes of the present and axes of like movement. And it seems that something like the future is particularly difficult to, I mean, ancestors can be kind of, you can almost see how it's relatively straightforward to bind yourself to the past, because quite often when someone dies, they're there, and all sorts of other relationships that are quite material and quantifiable, in terms of just, you've got something in front of you that you've got to respond to, and there's going to be some kind of response. Whereas being able to bind yourself to the future, to have a future, is a much more curious kind of idea. It's a much more, it doesn't seem like you're not immediately encountering, in the same way that you're encountering death, you're not immediately encountering the future. And so strategies and techniques, the kind of social sorceries that we might engage in to enable us to construct a future, one of those does seem to be persistently some sort of relationship to something like debt, something like a contract, something like a promise. These are all kind of, obviously there's lots of this stuff being played out in Nietzsche, and he has a particular way of thinking about this, but I'm kind of liking a bit of that in the background. But that, let me put it like this: even in a communist future, presumably there'll be some kind of relationships that people have debts to each other, or debts to society in some way, debts to an institution, or debts to something. That wouldn't disappear.
Yeah, for sure. But it's almost like you're using a word, debt, and Machine just mentioned it earlier about owing. Owning and owing, these sort of things. It's like debt seems to be one of those words that, like snow, you want to have 32 different words for the to describe the exact thing that you're talking about, because So I'm just remembering that thing about Lagolam. How do you pronounce it in Swedish?
No idea.
Oh, okay. That idea.
I don't speak Swedish.
Okay. That idea that when people would go out, the raiding parties would go out. I don't know, the 11th century or something like that. They'd go out and they'd come back with their spoils, and essentially they got divided up, each according to their need. People weren't given an equal amount. They weren't given a same amount. They were given an amount that was each according to their need. Which of course sounds an awful lot like Marx, sort of 600 years later, doesn't it? And so at a certain point there was this idea that the owing was both immediate, was of the past, and was of the future. It was because the present wasn't just of that moment, if you see what I mean. It was, people weren't living in a trifold sort of world, or a 3-seater sofa version of the past, present and future. They had a different understanding of how this was. And so when Marx says at the end of what Marx and Engels said at the end of the Communist, is it the end of the Communist Manifesto? Something like, arise, working class, you have nothing to lose except your chains. They mean in the future, but they're not talking of a future that we conceive of in a sort of discrete block of time. They're talking about something else. So maybe this sort of debt, wage, maybe these kind of things that we're thinking of it, maybe the thing that capital has done has kind of gone, okay, this is the past. Last week, when you earned X amount of money, this is the present, this is how you're working this week, and this is the future when you next get paid, or next Christmas, or your kid gets their sweet 16, or their 18th birthday, or their 21st birthday. You think about all the flags that capitalism puts there that become sort of points of celebration. It's like it's chunked everything up into these weird times.
Yeah, I like that. And that reminds me of what he was saying when he was talking about being an academic. And one of the reasons for doing that, like you mentioned, like not being a musician or an artist, is the regular paycheck that isn't kind of flaky. And I suppose that, when you was talking with her, I was thinking one of the things that seems fascinating is the way in which, in a sense, and it's plainly not true, but in a sense you can kind of think of capitalism as having or you can think of the money system element of it as having an incredibly functional role, of like say chopping things up into discrete segments. And you go back and then I'm sort of going back to thinking of the earliest kind of forms of writing where you actually are finding kind of accounts of things and you're finding like material triangle, in a sense writing as being a kind of quantifiable tracking space for these various different debts. And that we can speculate on. It's 1:45, so we're going to finish. I'm going to sort of push just to the last bit then, because one of the things that can kind of be thought of there is a kind of slightly different, to push this in a different relationship to the debts you might have. And one of the debts you might have is to the language you use and to the way in which you speak, because you have a kind of a relationship to language, and you have a kind of relationship to language in which it's kind of been gifted to you. And its use can be in good faith or in bad faith, and it's kind of premised upon this, the idea that you can't really speak until you can learn to lie, for example. You're not a practitioner of language. You haven't received the gift until you can do that. sort of shows that, in a sense, the use of language is not to tell the truth or to be clear, but to be in good faith. It's the kind of that's the relationship to good faith in its most clear essence, is speaking well, if you like, or speaking sincerely. And this is very central to the text I'm going to start teaching next week, the Plato's Phaedrus, where he sort of, what they're doing is they're having this discussion about rhetoric and about the use of rhetoric and the use of kind of like nice twisted arguments and all these kind of things that philosophers can sometimes do, but in bad faith. And there's a kind of argument that Socrates is making there. I can't. Something happened. I'm still an amateur at all of this. Something happened. Hello, thank you. Whatever it happened, that was probably good, and I get many thanks for it. But so that kind of. So one of the things I want to explore in the course is quite what Socrates, his kind of relationship to truth telling and wisdom in relationship particularly to language is, because this is one of the things I think it's difficult when we're talking. I mean, it's difficult to talk about politics and capitalism, I find, because in a sense there are too many kind of different languages going on, and quite often you're only really talking to a particular kind of group of people who already have a set of premises that you might accept. But you're not really talking about that. You want to be talking about the way in which we live with each other and the way in which societies operate. That's kind of my interest. I don't really give a shit about capitalism in some sense. If it wasn't here, that would be much better. But we'd probably be talking about something else. And so that, at the heart of all of that, is this kind of curious relationship to language and this kind of curious kind of speaking well notion that Socrates, I think we'll explore this. I'm probably wrong, but I think is trying to argue needs to be there. So. And the way in which I think this is articulated for them is through love, this relationship to love. So good faith, in a sense, presumably, I would want to say is something like good faith is necessary not just in order to have a kind of honest or authentic relationship, but in order to be able to express a kind of necessary love that must be the premise for anything social, and a kind of that in a sense is a kind of debt to this capacity to express it, capacity to say it, and the capacity to speak well. You have a kind of almost a debt to be able to do that, to pay that debt off by speaking well.
I have to go in a minute, but
I think perfect response.
I do remember though when the kids were little. You used to have this sort of moment of absolute rejoicing at the point that they told their first fib, the one that was just sort of, because you just knew that they were fibbing. And I can remember you saying to me, no, it's not lying. This is them sort of becoming human. Yeah. Actually, is like you have to be able to just... it's not about deception or anything like that. It's about trying to shape the world around you and trying to direct the world around you. And of course, what debt does is it's just a lie. You can't possibly owe money because money is an invention. You can't. So yeah, but unfortunately, I do have to go.
No, I think that's good, and we're going to wind up for the week there. Right, so yeah, next week, same sort of time, 7:00. I will actually usually log on a little bit earlier, about 6:30, 20 to 6, just in case other students need help and stuff. But we're starting to look at Plato and Deleuze, and we'll be starting, as I might have briefly alluded to there, with Plato's Phaedrus. And so, if you're interested in that, in River, I've put a little video up from someone that does a really good introduction to the Phaedrus. Gives you a good sort of background of like an overview of the text, overview of the story and the narrative, and some of the sort of background of what its role is. And there's a couple of other documents and bits and pieces up on River, and I might put them on Discord. So thank you very much, Morrigan, and thank you very much, Machinatus, and everyone else that was around. And I'll catch you next week.